Good morning, 141ers. Today, we're going to have a short video lecture. A couple of things that aren't necessarily covered in the text that I think are important if you're taking this class as a gen ed and viewing ag economics through the social science lens. And then one specific idea that has more to do with demand and supply that's relevant to chapter 3. So the first two items would be rational man theory, and number 2, revealed preference. Now, these are two assumptions that we hold as economists that set forth our basis for analysis going forward. So the first one, rational man theory, is the idea that people make decisions in their own best interest. It means that they do things thinking that they're going to be better off after they engage in the transaction or activity than they were beforehand. Some people get rational man theory confused. They think that it's this assumption that people do what's best for them. That's not true. They do what they think is best for them. That doesn't mean that people don't make mistakes. We're limited by our knowledge, and we're also limited by our ability to interpret that knowledge and make decisions. So one subset of that, this is in the textbook, I believe, is the idea of bounded rationality. Now, the word bound to me means limits, and the limits of your rationality or the limits of your ability to make good decisions are what we just talked about. How much information do you have, and what is your ability to interpret that information? And we find that sometimes people make what seems to be irrational decisions, but what it really is it's bounded rationality. I'll give you an example in my own life. And this, I swear, has happened before, where I've been in a Mexican restaurant, and Mexican and Chinese restaurants are the worst. I like Mexican and Chinese food, but one of the things that they're notorious for is having gigantic menus. I've been in a Mexican restaurant that had several hundred choices, and I became overwhelmed with choices and left because I couldn't make a decision. That would seem to be irrational, but instead it was just I hit the panic button. I didn't know what to do and left. There are famous studies that talk about people's unwillingness to enter into employee-sponsored retirements where they put in $1 and their employee puts in $1. So their return is doubled immediately, but they don't contribute because they can't pick which investment to put it into. So humans act kind of weird once in a while, but it's not because they're crazy. It's because sometimes their ability to make decisions is compromised because they have too many decisions or because they don't have the wherewithal to make good decisions. But in general, the key is to think people enter transactions, make decisions because they think it will make them better off. And as an aside, just think about any mistake that you've made in purchasing something. When you bought it, you didn't think it was going to be a mistake. Something happened, some new information became apparent, the item broke, it was smaller than you thought it was, the materials were poor, something along those lines that you didn't know about beforehand. Okay. Number 2 is the idea of revealed preference, and this does have something to do with markets to some extent. Revealed preference is the idea that people reveal what they want and what their preferences are. The preferences are, you have preferences, things you like. They reveal those things through their actions, not necessarily what they say. When we get into product differentiation, hopefully we get a chance to talk about Frito-Lay Sun Chips in regards to revealed preference. There are a lot of examples, but the bottom line is you have to believe what people do, not what they say. I say that I'm going to start running at 5 o'clock in the morning so I can be done running by the time my kids wake up at 6. But 5 o'clock rolls around a lot of mornings and I don't get myself out of bed. So just because I say I'm going to do something doesn't mean that I actually follow through with it. We have to watch my actions to see what actually reveals itself. Okay. People make decisions in their own best interests, believe what people do, not necessarily what they say. That doesn't mean people are liars. It just means sometimes they don't necessarily know their preferences, or they don't follow through with what they think or say is best for them. Okay, so that's part 1 of 3. The second part is really kind of a vocabulary type issue, and that's going to be, I don't know, I'm going to get used to this camera eventually. A little more in-depth analysis of this idea of opportunity cost. So opportunity cost is it's what you give up to do something. So sometimes we call it the next best thing, or I think of it as what would you do if the primary choice didn't exist. So in a regular class, I might say, hey, what's the opportunity cost of class today? And students would, some of them would get busy and they try to figure out what the cost of 1 hour of a class that meets 45 times, how much that would be. Well, the thing is, there is no actual cost to attending class because you paid that up front. Class is prepaid. Instead, the cost is what we call implicit. You give something up that you don't actually have to take out of your pocket and give to someone. You just forego the opportunity to do something. So imagine if you went to your normally scheduled class on campus and there was a sign that said class is canceled. Well, what would you do with that hour? If you take a nap, and that's what you actually do, then the opportunity cost of class is a nap. Another common phrase that's pretty much the same as opportunity cost is trade-off. And trade-off is, I mean, now the English language is a pain because there's so many synonyms and things that mean the same thing. Trade-off and opportunity cost really are the same thing. You can just think about times where there are subtle differences in their use, where you're actually trading something off. You know what those things may be, and you might use the word trade-off. To make it worse, there is a third term that we can use for opportunity cost or trade-off, and that's economic cost. And economic cost is simply saying when we do something, when we produce something, when we consume something, there could be both an explicit cost and an implicit cost. So I'll give you an example. If this morning you want to watch some TV and you have some sort of cable provider and you're watching real-time TV, not Netflix or Amazon, something like that, and you decide that you want to watch the news. So you watch the news for an hour. What is the cost of watching the news? What's the economic cost? Well, it's only implicit. If you're watching the news for an hour, that means you don't get to watch another show for that same hour that's running at the same time. The cost is implicit only. In other situations, we have explicit and implicit costs. Now, instead of going to watching the news, tonight you're going to go to a movie. You go to the movie takes 2 hours. So there's an implicit cost. What would you do with that 2 hours had you not gone to the movie? But there's also an explicit cost. The ticket is $9 or $10. Economic costs are just saying, hey, we have to make sure that we understand that both costs are relevant. So opportunity cost, trade-off, economic cost, all really the same thing, just subtle differences in their use. If any of those hang you up, just say, hey, can you slow down and let's talk about that some more. Okay, last item, number 3. These things called related goods. Okay, there's 2 types of related goods: substitutes and complements. Just put S and C for short. But we have to remember, substitutes in consumption and complements in consumption are not the same thing as substitutes in production and complements in production, or demand and supply. What we're talking about is when related goods change prices, that moves markets. It increases or decreases demand. It increases or decreases supply. Just remember that they're not the same thing. Consumption's pretty easy. Substitutes in consumption are things that you substitute or consume in place of each other. Mountain Dew and Mellow Yellow are substitutes in consumption. Complements in consumption are things that you like to consume together. Hot dogs and hot dog buns. When the price of hot dogs goes up, what happens to demand for hot dog buns? It goes down. This is an area where memorization doesn't do you a whole lot of good. Just thinking through, what does common sense tell me? What would happen to demand for hot dogs when the price of hot dog buns goes up? Well, people don't want to buy hot dogs unless they have buns, and if buns have become more expensive, we're going to buy fewer hot dogs. Okay? Same thing with substitutes. Production is a little bit trickier because we don't always think about these things. Substitutes in production are things that firms can produce using the same technology and know-how, the same economic resources. Corn and soybeans are a perfect example of substitutes in production. I've never met a farmer that can produce corn that can't produce soybeans. When the price of corn goes up, what happens to our soybean acreages? Goes down. It's more, why would I plant soybeans if corn prices are $7 or $8? Okay? Complements in production, also known as byproducts or co-products. If I produce something, I get something that goes along with it. Distillers' grains and ethanol would be an example. Sheep and wool would be an example. And you can really just think about those 2 things being put together. If the price of one goes up, supply of the other is going to increase as well. Okay? Clearly, this is straight out of your reading. Just wanted to really drive home the point. They're not the same thing. Okay, as a reminder, you should be through the reading. You should be working on your assignment that's due tomorrow at 11:59. And then remember, Friday you have a quiz that's due. There's also a Zoom session tomorrow. So I hope to see you there. This short lecture ought to give you a little jump start. See you later.